We're going to have 4 speakers who each make a brief presentation, and then after the 4, we're going to have a Q&A. Because of the size of the room, that will need to be submitted in the chat function on Zoom. You can submit a question at any time during the presentations. We'll get to them as many as we can in what will be roughly a half hour of Q&A at the end. We are recording this, so it will be available tomorrow. We'll link it to our Facebook for streaming for those who could not be here tonight or would like to see it again. We're very proud to be part of Dream Week again this year, and we're taking this opportunity to look at several sites in San Antonio, 3 that survive and have been threatened, and also 3 that have been lost. The challenge of underrepresented narratives and equity, inclusion, social justice in historic preservation is a very active one. In fact, 2 of our speakers will be speaking again next week at another conference covering many of these similar issues. So this is a very timely and important issue. I'd like to thank the World Monuments Fund, which has supported the coalition and put the Woolworth building on their World Monuments Watch 2020, which is now in its 2nd year. In fact, they are taking nominations at this time for World Monuments Watch 2022. So here are our speakers. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and if I miss anything, speakers, please say it. But we'll be starting with Everett Fly, who is an architect, landscape architect, and fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. He also was noted for winning the National Humanities Medal in 2014, and he is also noted locally for extensive research into African American history, not only in the center of the city, but throughout Bexar County. Then we'll have Sarah Zenaida Gould. Dr. Gould is the interim director at the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. She's also co-chair of Latinos and Heritage Conservation, and is prominent with the Westside Preservation Alliance and many other organizations in town. Following that, we're pleased to welcome from New York, Nancy Rankin, who is an architect. She's been involved in many restorations, including the famed Tweed Courthouse and Hamilton Grange in New York, the Octagon in DC, many other buildings across the country, and was one of the principal investigators for Waite and Associates that did the report that was released last fall on the Woolworth, Palace, and Crockett buildings. And finally, we'll have Dr. Antonia Castaneda. She is also on the board of Latinos and Heritage Conservation, as well as the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites, and a member of the Westside Preservation Alliance. So thank you all very much for joining us for this important Dream Week event. And I think we'll get started with Everett Fly.
The case that I'd like to share with you this evening is the St. James African Methodist Episcopal Church, and it's located in downtown San Antonio, just north of the Spanish Governor's Palace and just east of San Pedro Creek. Actually, many people don't know that the St. James Church originated out of the white Methodist church that was called Payne Chapel before 1865. Slaves who belonged to members of the church were actually allowed to attend services. And so in 1865, when emancipation came, that group of slaves began to look for places and ways to worship. Almost immediately after emancipation, missionaries from the Methodist Episcopal Church began to come to San Antonio, came to Texas. By 1867, a number of those missionaries had started their efforts in places like Galveston, Austin, and even LaGrange. By December of 1867, Black San Antonio Methodists began to raise money for what they called an African Methodist church. Bear with me, I've got I've got a technical problem. It won't let me move. Just hold on. There we go. There we go. So by 1867, in December, the Black Methodists had begun to raise money here in San Antonio for an African Methodist church. A minister by the name of Haywood was sent to San Antonio and began to work with other Black residents to establish a church. But by 1868, there was a schism or division that developed, and a great deal of this some of it was political, but some of it had to do with the name African or African Methodist Church. There were some members of the Methodist Church that didn't want the African name associated with their church and with their religion. And so two factions, many people don't know that two factions actually developed, and it resulted in a court case, and that case stretched out for 2 or 3 years. By 1870 and 71, the group had separated, and the AME group began to meet in the Minger Soap Works, and many of us know the location of this. It is also on San Pedro Creek, and many people know of that African Methodist Episcopal Association. But eventually, the lawsuit was settled, and the AME group began to look for ways to build a building, and the Methodist Episcopal group also began to look for a separate home, physical home and building for their congregation. The Methodist Episcopal group actually became what we now know as the St. Paul Methodist Episcopal Church. By 1875, the AME group had raised enough money and bought a property. The image on your left is an article from August of 1875, and it says that the laying of the cornerstone of the African church. And it's on Cameron Street, and that's the current site that we're recognizing now. The image on your right shows you a copy. It's an 1880 plat of the AME church site, and you can see the San Pedro Creek on the left, Cameron Street on the right, and the clear label that says AME Church. But many people don't know that St. James AME was very, very prominent because it started so early in the work of the Methodist missionaries. It produced a number of prominent ministers, and I'm just giving you a quick outline. I've been working with the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum and some of their team of researchers, and we've developed quite an impressive list of ministers. But here's three right here. Reverend Carson, Rufus Carson was the co-founder, one of the co-founders of the Paul Quinn College. Bishop Abraham Grant was also one of the co-founders of Paul Quinn College. But Bishop Grant, after working in San Antonio at St. James, became the 19th AME bishop in the United States. In other words, he rose to a national post. And he also became the 4th Grand Master of the Prince Hall Masons of Texas. Bishop James Crawford Embry, who served at St. James, eventually became the 25th AME bishop in U.S. history in 1896. So St. James was quite a proving ground and a testing ground for AME ministers. But they were also significant members of the St. James Church. One of the things that I did was search through census records, and this is an example. This is an 1880 census sheet, U.S. census sheet, and it was labeled beside Military Plaza. There's about 12 or 15 sheets for this Military Plaza neighborhood, and it turns out that it was a mixed race neighborhood. There were African Americans, there were white immigrants, there were Hispanics. But there was a concentration of African Americans literally within walking distance of the current St. James site, that the archaeological site. And again, just a few of those. James R. Davis was an 1873 trustee. His name is on the trustee deed, but by 1876, he ran for elected office in Bexar County, and the position that he ran for and was elected was called the hide inspector. And so all of you good historians, if you think about San Antonio's role in the cattle industry and agriculture, it would make sense. But Davis was the hide inspector, and he also was in charge of reviewing and inspecting brands to make sure they were clear. Ralph Booker was one of the early school teachers. He was also a trustee of St. James. And there was a gentleman named Mitchell Body. He served as an 1873 St. James trustee. He and his wife, Molly, lobbied the city of San Antonio for Black burial space in the city cemetery, which eventually became what we know as the city cemetery complex. I want to turn back to that I mentioned the Prince Hall connection. But we did a little bit more research and were able to find documentation that verifies that the first Black Freemason lodge in Texas was in San Antonio in 1873, and it was established at the St. James Church, at that site that we're now researching downtown. The first officers were all members of St. James, and they shared the Freemason Prince Hall history. And there's quite an extensive history on that. The Prince Hall Masonry originated in Philadelphia in 1775. So they were strong advocates, and these were Black folks. They were strong advocates for abolition, education, voting rights, and civil rights. And so when you track some of those people that I mentioned a moment ago, Booker and others, they were active in voting rights. Some of them were on the first list or roll of Black men registered to vote in Bexar County. These two articles, I know they're fine print. I don't expect you to read them, but I found these two articles. The one on the left is an 1875 article, and it actually says, and I'm quoting, it says, there will be more, building two colored schools will be more convenient to the colored children as they are settled in two large communities, one in the east and one in the west. And then the article on the right comes out 10 years later in the San Antonio Light, and it says in part, and I'm quoting, it says, the funds necessary for the erection of a two-room building for the colored children will be west of the San Pedro, end of quote. So these two articles verify the existence of major Black settlements or neighborhoods, one east of the San Antonio River, but one west. And the St. Paul Church was one of the kind of gateways to that west side Black neighborhood. One other interesting thing that we found in the research, these two articles, one on the left is an 1876, it's actually from the City Municipal Archives, and it's a city council record, and it's a lease for a firehouse for a colored volunteer fire company west of the San Pedro, as it says. The article on the right is an 1881 article, and it lists the officers of Fire Company number 3, which was colored. And the officers include Zach Irvin, who was a member of St. James, Jasper Thomas, who was a member of St. James, and George Williams, who was also a member of St. James. So this shows us the civic activity and civic engagement of St. James in the development of San Antonio. This photograph is looking to the southwest from the new Frost Bank Tower. And you can see the, in the middle left of the screen, there's some Black construction fabric outlining the footprint of the St. James Church. Um, I think it's really important to protect and preserve this entire foundation. I think that many of you are aware the National Register allows preservation of artifacts and extant materials, resources like this under what they call criteria B, and it says significance associated with important individuals or groups. A lot of times we only think about this in terms of the individuals, but I've given you a quick outline of the importance of the St. James group or congregation, and the documentation that we've discovered, I believe, could easily be applied to this particular site and particular resource, and more than meet the criteria for preservation. But as you look at this photograph, you'll notice that there are other traces or footprints of other structures, and of course, those would be the Menger Soap Works and the brewery that was located on the site. And so there's another National Register category, which is called cultural landscapes. And that criteria allows for the inclusion of landscapes that show evidence of human interaction with the physical environment. And so this overlay or layering here, I believe, gives us additional criteria or additional reasons to protect this site. Not only does it represent St. James, but it represents the industrial development of San Antonio in the soap works and the brewery. And it's still located, all of these layers are still located on the original site, right there adjacent to the San Pedro Creek. So again, this is an underrepresented resource. I've checked with the Office of Preservation, and they've indicated that there's no other complete archaeological resource like this related to African American history left in downtown. So once again, it's a threatened resource. It's an extremely rare resource. And as an architect and a landscape architect, I believe that there are some really creative and important ways that we could work to protect this. I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I'll look forward to answering any questions in the question and answer period. Thank you, Vince.
Thank you, Everett. And maybe you could just really briefly describe the nature of the threat, why it's threatened.
This resource, that site, as you can see, the San Pedro Creek is just to the right, and then the Alameda, the larger building, is on the west side of the creek. And this happens to fall in the San Pedro Creek Culture Park project. And part of the plans call for a pedestrian way along the creek and then along Cameron. And there's been discussion of the new plan to remove the footprint and the foundations that you see there in the photograph. So if the foundations were demolished, again, we would lose that resource. One other point to your question, Vince, is that you heard me mention the Freemasonry connection to St. James. The original 1875 cornerstone is still there in the northeast corner of the foundation. And when you look at some of the Freemasonry traditions and practices of construction, some of the guidelines indicate that the cornerstone is to be placed at the northeast corner. And so this foundation follows those guidelines with the placement of the cornerstone. And so once again, we have few remaining physical resources like this where we can actually go back and say they built it according to a certain guideline. They built this this church to serve a specific, the African-American community that was authentically located adjacent. And so if we demolish this, we lose all those connections, but we also lose that that physical resource, the foundation, the cornerstone, and its relationship to San Antonio's growth. And the St. James AME Church is still a functioning congregation, and it still exists on the west side of the river, west of the San Pedro Creek. It's about 2.5 blocks west of the Bexar County Jail.
Well, thank you again, Everett. We really appreciate that. We're now going to move on to Dr. Sarah Gould, who will talk about Los Courts, which were on the National Trust Most Endangered list this year.
I got it. Okay. Okay, thank you. I'm going to speak about the Alazán-Apache Courts, and a lot of my talk is drawn from work that I did curating an exhibit on behalf of the Westside Preservation Alliance and Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. So if you saw that exhibit, some of this might be familiar to you. Opened between 1940 and 1941, the Alazán-Apache Courts, also known as Los Courts, is the oldest and largest extant public housing complex in San Antonio. Located in the city's predominantly Mexican-American West Side and conceived at a time when housing, schools, and public facilities were legally segregated, Los Courts have provided affordable housing for San Antonio's working poor in an area where historically families have struggled with poverty, lack of municipal services, severe flood conditions, and high mortality rates. The Alazán-Apache Courts not only introduced critical infrastructure to the West Side, but for nearly 80 years have provided a critical safety net for thousands of people who have contributed to the growth of this city, a city that is currently experiencing an affordable housing crisis. Before the courts, in the early 20th century, the West Side's longstanding Mexican-American population swelled with the arrival of thousands of refugees from the Mexican Revolution. Small wooden houses, generally lacking indoor plumbing, electricity, and connections to the city's sewage system, proliferated. Sometimes called corrales, these communities struggled with tuberculosis, diarrhea, and other health issues associated with a lack of adequate sanitation, as well as house fires due to lack of adequate heating and seasonal flooding due to lack of flood abatement on the West Side. In 1921, a tragic flood hit San Antonio in early September. The West Side suffered the greatest losses. Of about 51 lives lost across the city, 47 were West Side residents, including many young children. The powerful flood washed away houses from West Commerce to South Laredo along both sides of the Alazán Creek, leaving thousands of West Side residents homeless. Soon after, because these people needed homes, more corrales appeared along the West Side creeks. Twice during the 1920s, the local Department of Health recommended creating new housing units to replace the corrales, but it would take another decade for the city to take that responsibility to turn that idea into a reality. Two figures play prominently in this story. In 1932, Father Carmelo Trencasi, who you see on the far left, arrived at Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, just a few blocks west of the Alazán Creek. And about 3 years later, in 1935, local architect Nathan Strauss Nafak joined forces with Trencasi to lobby elected officials, both locally and nationally, for help on the West Side. Both of these men cared deeply for the people and culture of the West Side. Father Trencasi supported the striking pecan shellers. He pressed the city to do more about the tuberculosis crisis. And what you see him doing in that picture is he published his own version of Las Posadas for the community at Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. Nafak similarly invested in the community. He actually went to Mexico to study architecture after he had already gotten his architecture degree at UT Austin. While he was there, one of the things he studied was the worker housing outside of Mexico City that predates the Alazán-Apache Courts, and that predates public housing in the US. And he designed, of course, several local Spanish language theaters, including his masterpiece, the Almeida Theater, which Everett just mentioned. Though the funding for the Alazán-Apache Courts was approved in 1937, building the courts was a complicated matter. Basically, the property owners who owned the land didn't want to lose their rental property incomes, and they wanted more money than the feds had allocated to purchase the land. A visit from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt helped move the stalled project forward, and 30 acres were cleared to make way for the Alazán-Apache Courts, which, when fully completed in 1941, housed nearly 5,000 residents. The first residents of the Alazán-Apache Courts were required to have an income between $350 and $850 a year. This actually left many Westside residents who made less money ineligible. Additionally, families with heads of household who were not citizens and those who had more than 8 members were disqualified. And yet, there were far more qualified applicants than there were available units. So the lucky 4,994 people selected to fill the 1,180 housing units at the courts experienced a new life with modern amenities like closets and electric water heaters and cooking ranges, as well as on-site social and recreation services, including a library, health clinic, nursery school, and adult education classes. As early as 1945, a study showed that the improved living conditions at the courts had a positive impact on residents' health. The Westside had long been home to the city's highest tuberculosis rates, but the mortality rate at the Alazán-Apache Courts was consistently lower than in adjoining blocks, which were areas that continued to struggle with inadequate housing and basic sanitation due to a lack of municipal services that unfortunately persisted in the Westside until the 1960s. Los Courts are also remembered because over the years, they've produced a number of notable San Antonians, including teachers, musicians, and politicians. I just put a few here. We've got Eva Garza, Gloria Rios, Blanca Rodriguez, Frank Wing, Al Alonso, Gilbert Vasquez, but there are many others. Celebrities aside, one of the most common stories that I heard about Los Courts when working on this exhibit that we did is some variation of my mom raised all of us kids there, and now my grandkids are college students, or I'm sorry, college graduates. It's important to remember that public housing is part of a safety net that promotes well-being, reduces poverty, and prevents homelessness in the United States. It provides low-income households with stable, affordable housing while freeing up income to meet other expenses like transportation, education, and healthcare. The Housing Act of 1937 first authorized public housing, including Los Courts, during the Great Depression, and then Lyndon Johnson created the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, in 1965 to oversee federal housing programs, including public housing. And our local hero, Henry B. Gonzalez, was also very involved in that, and you can see him here in this photo, looking over Lyndon's shoulder. Today, the need for public housing continues to grow, and affordable housing has become even more critical during the pandemic. Meanwhile, federal funding for public housing has dropped over 20% since 2010. Due to this underfunding, fewer families in need have been able to find placement in public housing, and money to maintain existing public housing and to provide services for residents has significantly dropped. The Alazán-Apache Courts is home to about 1,200 residents, a vibrant community in the downtown adjacent Westside. The majority of the households in the courts are female-led and have children, with over half of the court's population under the age of 18. Today, the Alazán-Apache Courts, along with the Lincoln Courts, are the last standing of the 5 public housing projects that were approved in San Antonio during the New Deal. And despite the fact that there continues to be a waiting list for public housing in San Antonio, Saha recently announced plans to demolish the Alazán-Apache Courts. Demolition of Los Courts would not only bring the loss of an architecturally significant site, but also the loss of a deeply embedded community, while paving the way for the gentrification that has already taken over so many other downtown adjacent neighborhoods. The families at Los Courts are among our city's most vulnerable, and they need affordable housing with easy access to downtown jobs. While deferred maintenance and aging amenities have created some willingness among current residents to see the property go, most of the property's problems could be resolved by rehabilitation. Indeed, rehabilitation of the Alazán-Apache Courts would preserve important architectural history, cultural history, and of course, affordable housing. Just this year, the National, actually it was last year now, how this January, but the National Trust for Historic Preservation named the Alazán-Apache Courts among their annual 11 most endangered historic places. The Trust's interest in Los Courts signals that this site has recognized national significance, that they tell an important piece of US history, a piece of history that would be removed from the landscape if it were demolished. We are having this event tonight as part of Dream Week, a way of recognizing Dr. King's legacy. And I just want to remind everybody that the last campaign that Dr. King worked on before he was assassinated was the Poor People's Campaign, a multiracial effort to bring economic justice to this country. And I really see Los Courts as having a connection to that fight for economic justice for poor Americans. I encourage you to check out some information that's available on the Conservation Society's webpage about how you can sign a letter to support the rehabilitation of the Alazán-Apache Courts. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I want to remind everyone that we will be providing information if you're interested in any of these particular issues and want to write a letter like Sarah just described. We'll be following up with that information both from our website and also with a follow-up email. So thank you very much. And next we have Nancy Rankin.
Thank you, Vince. Really want to thank the San Antonio Conservation Society for inviting me to listen today and also to participate in this panel discussion. I'm going to speak briefly about the findings of our work, which took about a year and a half to investigate not only the Woolworth building, but the two adjacent buildings, the Palace Theater Arcade and the Crockett Block, which are part of the Alamo Plaza National Historic Register district that surrounds the Alamo. As some of you may know, the F.W. Woolworth Company begins in 1912, and that same year they open, I think their 620th store in an existing building in San Antonio. And by 1919, things are going so well that they look to purchase the site of what was the bank whose name I'm forgetting right now, that was demolished to construct this building at the corner of Alamo Plaza and Houston Street. By 1921, the building is opened, and you can see the photograph here. We were engaged in 2019 to provide an overview and historical assessment of the three buildings that are on Alamo Plaza by the Texas General Land Office on behalf of the Alamo Trust. And part of this was a result of planning that is being considered to expand and improve interpretation of the Alamo site itself. The work that we were doing was to understand the significance and the level of integrity of all three buildings. The Woolworth building is highlighted in red on the map to the right. That's an illustration from the 1977 National Register Historic District map. What was very interesting to us were many of the designations that happened after 1977, and in particular, the 2015 UNESCO World Heritage Site designation, which looks at the San Antonio missions in total, the 5 missions and associated buildings that are further south of downtown San Antonio. The map to the right is from that nomination. The Mission Valero or Alamo site is in red. The Woolworth building is circled. next to that. You can see also in the photograph to the left, the Woolworth building in a 1937 photo with the Alamo in front. The designation in 2015 from the World Heritage Site designation is very specific about the buffer zone that surrounds the Alamo site. It includes not just the original National Historic District of the downtown commercial area of San Antonio, which really grew up after the ruin of the Alamo after the battle, but a wider area that further south also contains natural areas to protect the entire area from development that would be unsympathetic to the original mission sites. And they're really considered as a group, not solely the Alamo itself. So it really lent a different context to our thinking about the significance of the building, that it had not just a role in and of itself, but a role of protection from even further larger or more intrusive development onto the downtown historic site of the Alamo. So the work that we began doing was sort of two parts. We did quite a lot of historic and archival research to understand the original design and construction and changes over time to all three buildings. And that was pretty essential because today all three buildings are owned by the Texas General Land Office, and they are all operated in some way in a connected manner in terms of their building systems. And they're actually penetrations bearing walls of the adjacent buildings. So they really operate as three structures together. It was very interesting to look at the ownership and how that changes over time and what functions were in the other buildings. The Woolworth building really persists till 1997, but retail and entertainment functions have continued since then. This type of research includes both written archives. A lot of effort was spent during the later 20th century having to do with urban development pressures that were on the downtown area following the 1968 World's Fair and the Paseo del Rio linkage project. A lot of image research that we did primarily locally with help from local archives and repositories. So the second half of what we did was to take a very close physical examination of all three of the buildings. These are pages from the report that is has been released publicly and is available on the Alamo Trust website, I believe. We looked at each building with the same level of detail and investigation and looked to identify where original building fabric on the interior specifically remained, because of how important that would be relative to any potential suitability for reuse. Then, using that same set of techniques, we looked very closely at all levels of the Woolworth building. In particular, I want to talk about that obviously today in more detail. What was really important was to determine the character defining features. When the building had been listed in 1977, the designation report was very short. It was determined to be a contributing structure, but really only a few sentences about the exterior were documented in that designation report. We were asked to go a little bit deeper and really understand what remained of the interior building fabric. And as you can see from the plan, the original structural grid that was established at an angle really aligned with Houston Street, which had one of the primary entrances, that still persists. It's a very solid and well-built structure. The large spaces of white with an X through them are later modifications that have been made through the floor structure to accommodate their current uses, primarily for some of the amusement rides that are currently housed in the building. But the majority of the building structure remains. And in certain areas, those details and the vertical circulation through the building, the two stairs at either end, are still extant from the original 1921 construction. What was remarked upon in some of the articles right when the building opened was the sort of new and novel lunch counter that was described as being in the rear of the building on the first floor. So that was obviously of interest due to primarily the general history of Woolworths across the country and their role in the civil rights and sit-in movements in particular throughout the 50s and 60s. So we were able to identify here in the dashed area the location where that space was. I'll go into that in further detail in a minute. Today, these spaces really, for the most part throughout the building, have lost any detail, whether it remains buried behind some of this later potentially additive construction is a question in some areas. There are certainly locations where peeking behind walls, you can see a lot of the original plaster detailing, all of the exterior fenestration, the interior surfaces of those are still there. There's quite a lot, but it's very difficult to discern from the way that the building is currently being used. These are some of the back of house type spaces where those details reveal themselves between the staircases and some of the painted over borrowed lights, the details on the treads, the terrazzo inlay, as well as some of the plaster detailing at the columns and the coffered ceilings that would have been primarily on the first floor. So these are not public spaces today, and as you can see, they're not very frequently used or taken care of. So back to the lunch counter, we did want to understand that space in more detail. We were able to get a really good look at this historic photo, which is from a 1937 advertisement when they added air conditioning to the building for the first time and renovated the lunch counter. We were able to use photos like these to really dive into some of the details that we then could try to look for in the building itself. So this is a photograph from about a year ago, I would say, of the space, looking to the south, I believe. What you're seeing just to the right of that red ladder is a small back kitchen area, and the space right in front is where the lunch counter would have been located. And the way we know that is almost sort of a blend of architectural investigation to the point of archaeological level of detail, almost, to sort of look for the scars or the remnants or the details of certain decorative treatments or architectural configurations that remain. To the left, you're seeing a photograph of the floor where it's clearly evident the scars and the changes in materials of where the counter would have been installed and its curved shape. It was a semi-serpentine fashion, and it's very evident in this space, which is currently used as a storeroom behind a fast food restaurant. The quarry tile, very common kitchen and sort of utilitarian surface, and then markings in the floor at a very regular space for stools that would have been individually located around the perimeter. The photograph to the right is looking up above that entrance space into the kitchen. You can see actually two different finish treatments. We believe there were 3 different renovations of this lunch counter space, which would have been somewhat common to refresh and update this type of an area with a new modern look or theme. There's a sort of gray and red scheme to the left, and then an earlier scheme with wood and plaster composition, molding and detailing that remains. So between the one historic photograph that we had from 1937, and then the evidence that we were seeing in the field and how much of it we could see, we could sort of conjecture what we think the sort of overall layout would have been, with the kitchen off to the left, the way that you would have arrived to the space probably from the bottom and right-hand side. It would have been open. Today it's closed off with some later drywall partitions, but it would likely have been open to the main shopping floor and tucked off away and in the corner. So obviously understanding a little bit about this time period in San Antonio, specifically the events of March 16th, which had been really well documented in 1960, was a day where the community really had come together in an organized fashion, we learned, to peacefully integrate on the same day a series of downtown lunch counters. So we started looking at where those other buildings were and how they overlapped with the National Register District and where they were in relation to the Woolworth building. That just added another layer of thinking about how this building is not in and of itself the only building, certainly where there's any connections to the history of the civil rights movement and the struggle for integration, but that there are other buildings directly across the street that were also a part of it, and that they're just down the block. And these are also probably not only the only ones in San Antonio that followed, but these are the 7 that were right in the downtown area. We also, to try to put things into context, reviewed a 2008 document that's been put together by the National Park Service as a framework for identifying significant sites from the civil rights movement, which is, broadly considered to be a 14-year time period across the country. So that starts to give you a sense of how much we still need to learn about this period in time. And in 2008, that was just when we were starting to really begin a historic perspective on it, one could say, to be able to understand it relative to the places that we still have the tangible evidence of that moment in history. And we then looked at, I believe there are about 9 other Woolworth structures that are on the National Register currently across the country. Everyone's perhaps very familiar with the Greensboro, North Carolina structure, which is today a museum to the civil rights struggle in that building. And the lunch counter from that particular building is located in the Smithsonian Institute. But what was striking to us were these 2 individually designated buildings. The top, the Woolworth building in Fort Worth in Texas, not too far afield, and architecturally in terms of age and form and detailing very similar to the San Antonio Woolworth's building. That was constructed just shortly after and then listed on the National Register in 1994. And there is in that designation no mention of any real social history whatsoever. It is purely for its identified as significant for its commercial history and its architectural significance. Differently, the Woolworth building in Clarksdale, Mississippi, where there was much more of a violent and aggressive period of time in that area of the country, sort of opposite of San Antonio. The Woolworth building there is a 1955 structure. It's an international style. It's one of the last purpose-built Woolworth buildings in the country. And it is researched and listed on the National Register in 2009, several years later. And just in that time period, and 1 year after this framework is developed by the National Park Service, the building is squarely set for its associations with the civil rights movement in terms of its significance. And I wanted to read 2 quotes from that designation report. The first is that its significance beyond architecture and its commercial history is its connection to the civil rights movement as an example of resistance to the integration of public accommodation. And that's because what happened at this Woolworth's different from, again, San Antonio, which chose to integrate and to do so in a collective and peaceful manner with other downtown stores. The Woolworths in Clarksdale actually chose to remove and permanently close their lunch counter from the building, specifically to avoid any conflict with sit-ins or demonstrations happening at their structure. So the second quote I'd like to read about the significance of this building is that specifically the loss of the lunch counter to all citizens is the story that this building tells. And so I guess I wanted to put those two things in context just to see how over 15 years we can really change our perspective on why things are important to us and what other perspectives we can bring to the architecture that we're looking to retain as a record of our culture. And I want to make two quick comments about research that was not done by us, but outside of our work, but happening in parallel that are both really important. The information on the left is from a really terrific report also released to the public by the Alamo Trust entitled Civil Rights in San Antonio, World War II to the mid-1960s. It's authored by Carrie Lattimore and really dives into the social history of the civil rights movement in San Antonio, which is, as architects, not our forte, but something that we really encourage the trust to do, to really bring that level of scholarship and understanding to the community of what was happening at that time, to marry that information with the architectural and physical and tangible fabric that we had. And to their credit, the trust went right ahead and pursued that. And it's a really important, I think, companion bit of information to understand. And then to the right are two photographs. The upper photograph for a very long time was misattributed actually by the archive as a photograph of the lunch counter at the Woolworth building. And our physical investigations could not match up with this particular historic photograph. What we were able to locate is the photograph below, which is undated, but was published several weeks later and does match up with the architectural evidence and details that we found within the Woolworth building. So it just points to the need, this research was really spearheaded by the trust itself, and it points, I think, to the need to really focus on facts and to be very diligent in that sort of research so that when we expand and tell the wider story that these buildings offer, that we're being really, really scholarly with the information. And so that's the summary. I think the one other thing that Vince and I talked a little bit about that I think, I personally really came to learn and love about this project and this building is a wider understanding of how diffuse the civil rights movement was and what that means for preservation going forward. We're just scratching the surface, I think, with the significance of the civil rights movement, and current times are making us think even differently than we may have thought several years ago about it. And I just would really encourage a broad thinking that does not discount something just because it happened in many places. I think the fabric of our built environment can tolerate layers of meaning and the incorporation of as many of those stories as possible. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. And while we tee up Antonia's presentation, thank you for giving us a little insight into the evolution of preservation. Certainly when the Alamo Plaza was listed on the National Register back in 1977, there was I think a more limited approach to history and architecture than you've outlined there today. So thank you for that. Dr. Castaneda, please.
Individually and collectively, loss is a constant presence in our lives, whether loss of people, loss of belongings, loss of direction. Here we are talking about loss of community structures and buildings that have been demolished by public agencies or by public commercial interests, even as we waged major struggles to save them. For the communities who watched in pain and dismay as these buildings were demolished, their loss embodied the loss of memory, the loss of history, of presence, of knowledge, of cultural expression, both tangible and intangible, of culture and class aesthetics, of generations. Their demolition represents injustice and ultimately a form of violence directed against the peoples whose presence, histories, and memories are imprinted in the walls, in the ceilings, in the floorboards, in the rooms, and other spaces of now obliterated buildings. We struggled for and lost La Gloria, Univision, and the G.J. Sutton building. This is our story. La Gloria, meaning glory or heaven, the rooftop garden Matilde Elizondo built on the Westside corner of Brazos and Laredo in 1928 was a community institution, an open air social and cultural space above the food market, bakery, silent movie theater, and multi-pump gas station. Generations of Westside families celebrated weddings, quinceañeras, bautismos, First Holy Communions, and other ceremonies there. They came to listen to the sounds of jazz and blues and to dance to swing, to the Latin beats, and to early Tejano and conjunto music. Upon learning in 2001 that the newest owner was about to demolish La Gloria, community-based cultural arts organizations spearheaded by the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center and San Anto Cultural Arts created the Save La Gloria Alliance to protect, preserve, rehab, and repurpose this familial and communal space.
To imagine the people dancing on the rooftop of La Gloria. An 82-year-old woman donated $40 while we were fundraising for the building and said, "I'm going to dance there again," pointing to the dance floor in the sky. My own grandmother, the one I prayed to, never danced at La Gloria, nor did my mother. But that Monday after Easter, when they tore La Gloria down, I cried. Each time the bulldozer hit the building, I felt it in my heart, and I remembered my own history. Each time the bulldozer hit the building, I felt it in my heart, and I remembered my own history, my 6 nieces and nephews, and wondered, who will tell them the stories of their people? Each time the bulldozer hit the building, I felt it in my heart, and I thought silently, this is cultural genocide. To take away our history is to kill our people, our soul, our spirit.
The Save La Gloria Alliance appealed to city departments, commissions, and District 5 councilmen to grant La Gloria historic landmark status and to save it. The HDRC voted yes, the zoning commission voted no, and the district councilman said no, stating, quote, "It was an eyesore and a danger to the community," unquote. The Alliance fundraised to purchase a building, and in this slide, we see Gloria Ramirez being restrained as she tried to reach the owner with a check for his asking price for La Gloria of $2,339,000 and to stop the demolition. La Gloria was demolished. Vital cultural, social, and economic worlds of the working class Mexican-American West Side were violently erased from history. It is cultural genocide carried out on our communities. La Gloria matters because it was an institution created by and for the Mexican-American public, whose lives were circumscribed by de jure and de facto segregation, discrimination, and other structured racial, gender, and class inequalities within which the institutional fabric of San Antonio is woven. On February 15th, 1946, Raúl Cortés of San Antonio founded the KCOR-AM, the first Spanish language radio station in the United States, in a building of mid-century modern architectural design. Against tremendous odds, as he encountered difficulties getting a broadcasting license, he got approval for broadcasting over frequency 1350 AM. With the slogan, La Voz Mexicana, the voice of Mexican Americans, KCOR-AM broadcast on 500 watts. In 1955, Cortés followed this accomplishment by founding KCOR television, also the first Spanish language television station in the nation. A trailblazer in the expanding world of communications, Cortés was also deeply committed and involved in advocating for the civil rights, for the civic, cultural, and economic well-being of Mexican Americans, and served 2 terms as president of the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC. An image of demolition of the Univision with people on the sidewalk. We learned early in September of 2013 that KCOR TV, radio TV, Univision was sold to a real estate developer from South Carolina who had received a demolition permit to demolish the structure and build a 55 million apartment development on the land. Once again, we went into action, organized, went to OHP, HDRC, worked with San Antonio Conservation Society, who with us filed a lawsuit, went before HDRC again, met with City Council, with the mayor, got an injunction, stopped the demolition for 2 weeks. But in the end, the judge ruled we had no standing, unquote, and lifted the injunction. During our struggle, one public official said, why do you want to save that building? The building has no history. Another public official said, that building's ugly. Why do you want to save it? So I say this to underscore the response that we received from public institutions in San Antonio. The sign, "You are demolishing history," is from Mr. Hernandez, who came to our all-night vigil and brought this sign with him because his father worked at Univision, at KCOR becomes KCOR television, becomes Univision for all of his working life. He started as a very young boy and wound up working there for his whole life. And Mr. Hernandez wanted us to know that. This is a slide of Graciela Sanchez from the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center view facing the demolition. And I think that it represents and reveals the pain and the anguish of the erasure of history, of our legacies, of our lives. I also want to comment that 8 of us who were advocating for saving La Gloria did wind up going to jail in order to raise consciousness and bring attention to the importance of our buildings. So we are looking now at the G.J. Sutton building that was built in 1912. And so the first slide shows the inscription of the building on the building. And now we're seeing both the Samsco complex in its totality with the 3 sections that ultimately become the Sutton building highlighted. We see Garlington Jerome Sutton, who was born in 1908, was raised in San Antonio, and who, except for the period of his college years, lived and worked in his native city all of his life, where his family lived since 1889, when his father Samuel arrived in San Antonio and settled in a home at 430 North Cherry, and becomes a part of the vibrant African-American community. The Sutton's family original home, where GJ and his siblings were raised, is the section from the left of the stairs. From here, they went to church, to school, to social and to socially concerned gatherings. In Sutton's early 20th century San Antonio, de jure segregation maintained the separate and unequal dictums enforced by the city police. Upon returning home in 1938, where he and his brother Samuel took over the family's business, Sutton and Sutton Funeral Home, GJ joined the local chapter of the NAACP, chaired the organization's education committee, mobilized African-American voters, and became a vocal advocate for civil rights. He advocated for a city ordinance banning segregation, and in 1960, he and members of his family joined the college's sit-in at Joski's to protest the management's refusal to desegregate the upscale Camilla room, which was eventually desegregated. In 1965, the San Antonio City Council approved an anti-discrimination ordinance which Sutton championed, but it did not end de facto segregation. Also in 65, Samsco declared bankruptcy, and Sutton, who was always concerned about the welfare of his community, argued for revitalization of St. Paul Square, the historic area within which the Samsco complex is located, because he believed it would create jobs and opportunities for the African. Sutton began actively campaigning for the state of Texas to acquire the former Samsco complex and to be used as offices. His political and civil rights activism led him to run for state office, and in 1972, he was elected to the Texas state legislature on a platform for equality in living conditions, wages, and education. 3 years into his tenure, Sutton pushed an appropriations bill for the state to purchase the 112,000 square foot land that Samsco was on for a price of $750,000. He argued that the complex should be rehabilitated as the first state-owned multi-agency complex that would save the state from having to rent space, thereby saving money. J.G. Sutton suddenly died of a heart attack on June 22nd of 1976, his 68th birthday. And that same year, State Representative Jim Nowlin suggested that the newly acquired state building should be named for Sutton. After Sutton's death, his wife, Lou Nellie, succeeded him in the Texas House of Representatives. She pushed through a $3.6 million bill through the state legislature to rehabilitate the former Samsco building. And in October of 1982, saw the official dedication of the G.J. Sutton State Office Complex, the first state-owned property in Texas named after an African-American elected official. The G.J. Sutton building provided state office space from 1982 to 2013, when it was closed due to widespread deterioration and structural instability. Like the death of G.J. Sutton, the demolition of the Sutton building in 2013 was an unexpected, devastating blow to the African-American community and to preservation/conservation organizations in San Antonio. The Texas Facilities Commission, the state agency that owned the property, determined that the condition of the building placed the safety of staff at risk and decided to sell it without informing the family, the city's mayor, or District 2 councilperson. Despite opposition from family and community, Governor Abbott signed House Bill 2944 in June of 2019, authorizing the sale of the state-owned property to a private developer to, quote, pave the way for a new development, unquote. Since the state is not required to get local demolition permits, the city had no warning of the impending sale. Calls for rehabbing and repurposing the Sutton building were met with the all too familiar answer of, quote, too expensive to rehab, unquote. The Sutton building, which is a short walk from St. Paul Square, the Alamo Dome, and the Hemisphere Plaza, was sold at a market price for the 5.9 acres of $10 million. Okay. Why, we must ask, despite our community's valiant struggles, despite exhausting every legal avenue, appealing to elected officials, following all the rules and forms of historic preservation, and oftentimes agreement from the city, state, and even national preservation institutions, are our historic buildings demolished, our histories erased? Why does this happen? What allows this to happen? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Castaneda. Appreciate it. I'll allow the slide to continue running. We've don't have a huge amount of time left, but I'm willing to stay on a little longer. I have a couple questions that I'd like to, for specific panelists. First, for Dr. Gould. Question came in. It seems that the Housing Authority and city officials have been resistant to preservation of the Alazán courts. Is it possible that they would support preserving at least a portion of it as an example of the original construction?
You know, I'm not sure if they're open to saving a portion. I know that I would just say that given the significance of the architecture as well as the severe need for that housing, I would really hope that any kind of negotiation would take those things into consideration. So I have not heard if maybe they would save some of it and not all of it, but it is, I think that maybe that just kind of misses the point about the architecture and about this enormous need that our city has for affordable housing. Saha has a waiting list for its units, and I'm not sure. I saw Shannon Miller in the group before, and I know she says all the time we can't build ourselves out of the affordable housing crisis. And I think she's absolutely right. We need to hold on to what we have, update it, of course, because unfortunately there's a lot of deferred maintenance there, update it, but then we just need to build more.
Yeah. Sarah, a quick follow-up question came from another person. And she said, is there any effort to quantify the financial benefits that are inherent in it or embedded in a tight community like you find at those courts?
I love that question. And unfortunately, I'm unaware of any effort to do that. It sounds like a great study for a sociologist, like maybe Christine Drennan, or maybe she's already even done some of that. But you're absolutely right. There's absolutely a value to those social networks that people have at the Alazán, whether it's through free babysitting or a ride to the store. But you do have to think about what's going to happen when those folks are dispersed across the city if the Alazán is torn down. There will be an economic impact to their social networks being torn apart. There will be of course a cost probably that will last them for years. So that's definitely a good question to ask. And unfortunately, I'm unaware of any studies like that.
Great, thank you. Everett, I have a question for you that also came in. Can you discuss the dilemma that the public will weigh in regarding partial versus full preservation of the church foundations? What are the trade-offs and issues to consider?
Thanks, Vince. So, well, for me, the trade-off, I mean, several of the other speakers have touched on it, is it always seems that what I call it, the traditional styled architecture, the decision makers say, well, that's worth saving. But San Antonio has, as you've heard the speakers say, has erased so much working class history, Hispanic history, African American history. If the St. James that I talked about, if it's demolished, I feel like again, it's just another insult to, you know, the efforts of those people to get that land. I mean, though we found articles and articles that describe almost like nickel and dime raising the money to buy that land. You know, these were people that were coming out of slavery. And so to make a decision now and say, oh, well, that's not important, we'll just erase it or wipe it off the map. I mean, it's just, to me, it's disgraceful. If you're going to, I feel like if you're going to help encourage and build the self-esteem of a community, you don't demolish it or pick it up and say, well, we're going to take it somewhere else. I think it's a part of the fabric. The project is called the San Pedro Creek Culture Park. So how can you be honest and faithful to that title and topic if you're going to erase something this authentic?
Thank you, Everett. And we do have one person on who commented that they're one of the archaeologists working on that site, and it was one of the highlights of their career. There are a couple questions just to clear up about. This isn't the beginning of the African Methodist Episcopal Church per se. That began some years earlier. But when did the church leave? What is and where is it now?
So about 1877, 78, the church sold that property on Cameron Street, and they moved a few blocks west. Those of you in San Antonio will know the Santa Rosa Hospital. There's a parking lot that's just north of the Santa Rosa. There was a Black neighborhood there, and that's where the second St. James moved. It was at the corner of Zavalla Street, and they moved there. And we found some newspaper articles that said that the nuns at the Santa Rosa complained about the St. James congregation singing too loud. And from there, they stayed there until the 1880s, they stayed there through the 1880s. And in 1923, they moved to Richter Street, again, west of the San Pedro, west of the river, to the current location on Richter. And that's where the current St. James AME Church still is active.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to turn to Nancy now. Thank you, Nancy, for that fascinating presentation. I especially like the way you contextualized it. Many of the people here at the Westside Preservation Alliance and Esperanza are very familiar with how preservation has evolved in terms of looking at more of the social history. You showed a wonderful map that showed the other lunch counters. And I seem to recall from the report, maybe you could comment that those traces you found of the lunch counter, that's the most we found in any of the buildings, as far as we know. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, we did get the opportunity to go into the Crest building, which was under a renovation, and clearly found the space. What the trust had done was gone to the National Building Museum and went through the Crest archives to find additional photographs that they had there. And we could certainly see the scale of the space and could locate where that was, but everything is stripped back to the concrete frame of the building. There's no remaining architectural detailing there as well. And we went into two of the other spaces as best we could, the two that are in the National Register Historic District footprint, and just surfaces are completely covered. If there is anything remaining in the floor, it's been covered by a new ceramic tile floor. If there's anything on the walls, there's either been removed or it's been over applied. So there's nothing. It was sort of a brief investigation, but nothing else that we could see readily from being able to access the public spaces only.
Right. I'm going to look for more questions, but just one quick follow-up on that. How do you think it's changed? I know Everett and I appeared on TV a couple of years ago talking about civil rights tourism, and you mentioned that the Park Service guidance on civil rights in America only came out in 2008. How has this changed over the last 10 or 15 years?
Well, I think there's a put wider to take a look at some of the earliest designations, not only for civil rights history related to, this particular moment in time, but all sorts of other layers of new information that we have about underrepresented communities that have an equal or contributing story to tell relative to the history that was documented at an earlier time when the historic preservation movement started and when the national legislation took place. There was a real scramble to get as many things protected as possible in a short time. And a lot of times there was just one story or one period of significance or one historical event. And when you really look at a building that's been around even just as long as the Woolworth building, but others that have lasted longer, they don't have just one story. It's as if you could say your life only has one story. There are movements through history that are important to reflect, and to the point of not building your way out of affordable housing, we also need to retain as many buildings, not just for their contribution to history, but relative to the environmental crisis and climate change, to try to retain and reuse things. And we've been doing that, and that leaves lots of different stories along the way with changes of use over time. And I think there's going to be an expansion of that starts to get recognized at the national level, and a reevaluation or reexamination of the significant, maybe a deeper understanding of the integrity that connects to that significance of structures should be taken across the country.
Great. Beth Standiford, the librarian here at the Conservation Society, has just posted in the chat a website with links to contact officials if you're interested in putting your 2 cents in on any of these battles. I'd like to turn to Dr. Castaneda and remind everyone that we are going to have the recording of this available tomorrow afternoon at some point on Facebook streaming. Dr. Castaneda, you gave us examples of terrible losses between 2004 and 2019 is over that same 15-year period that we're just talking about in another context. Are things getting better? Have we saved anything? Where do you think we are in terms of the balance?
So I would like to think things are getting better, but I'm not very optimistic at this point. What we have found, or at least what I've found as part of community-based cultural arts and preservation organizations, is that the institutions that address the issue of preservation, as well as city officials, elected and public officials, who make decisions about what is to be preserved or not. One in San Antonio, I'm sorry to say, don't really have knowledge or understanding, and it seems to us oftentimes aren't too terribly interested in the history of working class communities, such as the west side of San Antonio and the east side also. So that's one general area, which is why we have tried so very hard to raise consciousness, concientización, raise awareness. The other is the policies that, the preservation policies that don't, both at the local level, state and national level, that don't accommodate or account for these historic structures of Latino, African American, and other communities, working class communities in general. And then finally, or also related to the same set of issues of addressing public officials, is that the structures of the governance structures of, let's say, San Antonio, when one wants to advocate for something as everyday working class and other folks in the community, citizens or not, that want to raise an issue, we have 3 minutes to speak before the City Council. Whereas developers and lobbyists and folks with money who can take and do take publicly elected officials to lunch or dinners or whatever, get their ear. And also a related issue, and here I'm not trying to be critical of staffs who work very hard all of the time, but staffs who also don't have necessarily a background in the history and cultures of San Antonio, write reports, make decisions, make recommendations to City Council, for example, that then are based on what we consider lack of, one, knowledge and information, and two, understanding. And where are they going to get that understanding? So part of our effort certainly has been to engage and to meet with different department heads and different departments throughout the city. And we participate in various city-run organizations as well as commissions. But we are, as the Westside Preservation Alliance and the Esperanza, we are volunteer organizations in the case of the Westside Preservation Alliance, the WPA. In the case of Esperanza, they have staff, but it's a very small staff that has a significant work to do just to stay afloat as a nonprofit and also engaged in the community. So it's a range of issues.
Yep.
And then the other, and finally, is a question of as I briefly mentioned, the structured inequalities that is at the base of our societies. And so those are the range and the configuration of issues that come together in our efforts. Unfortunately, in the 10 years that since we founded the WPA, certainly we've made some progress, and certainly we can point to some quote unquote successes, but the losses are greater, and we're working on the Alazán-Apache Courts. So.
Thank you very much. And I have one more question I want to relay, because I've been asked twice to Dr. Gould. Sarah, what strategies do you envision, and this relates to what Dr. Castaneda just said, what strategies do you envision for retaining physical and cultural integrities at neighborhood scale in the West Side?
I think there are a couple of things that we could talk about. One would be a moratorium on demolitions. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of structures that get demolished on the West Side because of the same problem basically that the courts have, and that's deferred maintenance. Our West Side residents don't necessarily have the money to maintain their homes, although there is a very high percentage of home ownership on the West Side, but the homes are sometimes, not always, in need of repairs that the homeowners can't afford. And so if we can maybe think about expanding that great local program we have for rehabilitation, if we can think about a little bit of compassion about, if your porch is sagging, don't fine that household for their sagging porch, but rather, try to help them get connected to resources. We have an architecture program here in San Antonio at UTSA that, perhaps there's ways to expand the ways that they can get involved in those sorts of community efforts, especially as UTSA is now planning to expand into the West Side. How can existing entities help communities stay in place? Because I think that if folks can stay in place, they'll want to stay near their friends, their family, their social networks. So I think that we can think about what are some policies that we can enact or expand to help people stay in place. And for me, I think the first thing is to see how can we put a moratorium on demolitions, because if you happen to be on that list that gets sent out about demolition warnings in San Antonio, you'll notice the West Side is one of the most commonly listed areas of town on that list. And it's not the only part of town that's struggling with that, but it's certainly a big issue there. And I think that we already have some programs in place that if they could just be expanded, we could help so many people.
Great, thank you. And thank you for also answering another question that got asked there earlier. We're 10 minutes over, but I would like to just, one more question that did come up a couple times for Everett. Everett, where are we in the San Pedro Creek planning process? I mean, when is the decision made? Are they going to keep some of it, all of it? Where are we in the process right now?
Well, Vince, my role in working with the SACAM was to gather whatever research we could, for those criteria, those national register criteria, to determine if that physical footing was eligible for nomination to the National Register. So we've completed that work and submitting it to the River Authority in Bexar County and the U.S. Corps of Engineers. And they will, my understanding is that they will review the historic information, and that there are some public input discussions that are coming, and then some final design decisions. So we're in process, completed the research, and waiting for deliberation from, like I said, the Corps of Engineers, the Texas Historical Commission, the Office of Preservation, and them working with the River Authority and their designers to see what options might be possible.
Well, thank you. Again, I want to be respectful of people's time, but I really want to thank each of our 4 presenters. There's been some wonderful comments in the chat about how each of the presentations were really excellent, and I can't agree more. Thank you so much. I really do think that this is the future of heritage conservation is looking at these underrepresented stories, figuring out ways to identify what the community values and understand the nature of that value. I think someone said, as Nancy Rankin said, that sort of intersection of significance and integrity. There are traditional views, and Dr. Castaneda mentioned how traditional preservation policies sort of don't always work that way, but there are people, I think, who are looking at it in a new way and sort of turning some of those policies on their heads. I'm just going to give my presenters a chance to say some sort of final thing before we wrap up, but thanks again to everyone who joined us, and especially to Sarah, Antonia, Everett, and Nancy. Thank you. Oh, Sarah, do you want to do a quick pitch for the presentation that you will be doing with Antonia next week?
Sure. So next week, there's a conference through the University of Maryland at College Park called Decentering Preservation. And if you go online to the University of Maryland College Park's architecture program, you can register there. It's free. It's a 2-day conference. And some really fantastic speakers are going to be there, representing the Asian Pacific Islander American population, the African American preservationist movement, Latinos and Heritage Conservation will have several representatives speaking. And it's great to have that platform through a university program that's so well recognized in historic preservation. And again, it's free. So if you'd like to check that out, please just visit the University of Maryland webpage. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks again, everyone. Really appreciated the opportunity to participate in Dream Week on behalf of the Coalition for the Woolworth Building, Conservation Society, Esperanza, Westside, SACAM, San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum, all of our partners in the coalition, as well as World Monuments Fund. Appreciate it. Have a great Dream Week, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight.
It's a real pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.
Stay
Thank
safe
you.
and wear your masks.
Thanks, will do.
Yes, ma'am.
Take care, everyone.
Take care. Thank
Be
you.
safe. There.